So we have covered the tenacious defense after a6 and b5 to try to keep the extra pawn. But again, white's extra development gives him more than enough to get an excellent play. Now, instead of a6, black has other options available, such as knight c6 and c5. So let us look at the move c5, and the primary idea is to try to liquidate white center. So if white center is gone, then black can try to finish the development and hope for a good game. But again, the problem persists is the lack of development. So white simply ignores this move c5 and castles, and black plays knight to c6. Now if black tries to be greedy and take the pawn on d4, then after knight takes d4, for example, if bishop c5, then queen a4, bishop d7, queen takes c4, white immediately gets an upper hand. So b7 is hanging, black has to give up his powerful bishop for the knight, and on top of all the things, white is going to get the bishop pair and still huge advantage in development. So if black tries to play knight d5, then again after queen a4, knight b d7, queen takes c4. This has happened in the game Kramnik against Neidich. White got an upper hand, knight 7 to b6, simply queen b3. And again, black's pieces are badly coordinated. These knights are not quite well placed. The bishop on c8 is weak, has no future. Black is down on development, and this is simply much better for white. He's going to play knight c3. He can play rook d1. The bishop can go from c1 anywhere. And again, the bishop on g2 is really powerful. White can follow up with a4, a5. Just so many different options. And even though there is no pawn center, the position still remains a big problem for black. So let's go back. So we have pawns on c4, c5, white pawn on d4. And so the best move for black here is knight c6. And now this is the key move for white, knight to e5. Notice that knight on to e5 is very thematic in the Catalan. So we've seen knight e5 in the previous variation, in the a6 variation. We've seen knight e5 in the b6 variation, and now again knight e5 in the c5 and knight c6 variation. So after knight e5, all the options lead to a very good game for white. So let's just take a look what could happen again if black tries to be greedy, and if knight takes d4, so he gets the second pawn. But now after this quiet move e3, it turns out that black is actually completely lost, because if knight f5, queen trade followed by knight to f7, and white is simply winning. So that means the knight on f5 is kind of trapped. Sorry, on d4 is kind of trapped. So this is already a big problem. Well, you might ask, what about pawn takes d4? Again, after knight takes c6, b takes c, white gains the exchange. After bishop d7, queen takes d4, black doesn't have sufficient compensation. The c4 pawn falls as well, and this is simply losing. So all of these different exchanges in the center always favor white. So that basically limits black to only a few moves. And the correct move here is bishop to d7. With a simple idea, of course, if knight takes e6, bishop takes e6, to trade the light square bishops. But now white actually builds up his position. He simply plays knight to a3. This is a nice little quiet move, but it's very powerful. But before we go deeper into this variation, I want to talk a little bit about this other taken, knight takes e5. It looks as though this is very simple way to simplify the position to an endgame, and after d takes e, queen takes d1, rook takes d1, knight to d7, it looks as though black is about to solve all his opening problems. Not only is he up at pawn, he's gonna win probably the pawn on e5 if white doesn't defend it, and it's an endgame, so that you might think that this should give black more chances to get a good game. But in reality, this position is very, very difficult. And instead of defending the pawn with bishop f4 or even f4, let me show you how white can get very strong advantage, almost a winning position immediately. And this is after knight a3, knight takes e5, so white has sacrificed the second pawn, bishop f4, hitting the knight, knight g6, and now the star move, and after which Rybka gives huge advantage to white. Notice that computer, who usually likes material, here actually prefers the development. And after bishop c7, bishop e7, knight takes c4, for example, castle, white simply plays rook a to c1, and if you look at this position, you realize that black has no moves. He's completely paralyzed. His bishop on c8, the rook on a8, paralyzed. The knight on g6 is paralyzed. The bishop on e7, well, if he goes to bishop f6, what's next? There are no moves, whereas white can build up his position. He can play b3, followed by knight d6. I'm not even mentioning immediate bishop d6. And if bishop to g5, then we can build up our position with the move f4. So white can improve his position and get back the pawn, whereas black is actually suffering and has real no future to get any active play. So we saw the very instructive endgame after knight takes knight, and real serious problems for black. And that leads us to the only move, bishop to d7, and which is the main line. And now after knight a3, as I mentioned earlier, black really has no choice but to take the pawn. C takes d, and knight takes c4. And let me talk a little bit about this position. So for now, black has an extra pawn, but this is only for a very short time. In the meantime, white is almost done with his development, his bishop on c1. But the bishop on c1 already has a good diagonal, whereas black still needs to develop his f8 bishop and castle. And so let's take a look what would happen if bishop to c5. Now I recommend the move a3. Notice that immediate idea b4, potentially b5, or even bishop b2 come into play. And after a5, we're following game between two very strong grandmasters, Boris Avruch and Daniel Friedman. And Boris Avruch is actually a well-known world expert in decathlon. This Israeli grandmaster produced a lot of new ideas, and he just simply plays bishop f4 in this position. And let me show you how quickly he obtains a slight but lasting edge as white here. So castle, rook to c1. Notice how easy it is to develop for white, whereas black's pieces are a little bit awkwardly placed. This is the bishop on d7 is a real problem, a nuisance for black. So Friedman tries to at least create some havoc and go for the f4 bishop with knight d5. But this only leads to this simplification. Knight takes, bishop, queen takes, knight e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5. And as I mentioned earlier, typically in Grunfeld, whenever white sacrifices the pawn, he gets it back with dividends. And this is one of those positions. So white is going to get back the pawn on d4. So the bishop on c5 is hanging, and in the game Friedman played queen to b5, and here we can take the pawn on d4, and let me just show you what could happen. After bishop takes, queen takes, some simple simplifications, queen takes e2, bishop takes, pawn takes, rook to e1, queen f3, rook to e3. This is actually a good position for white, because if black plays queen to h5, white can simply get back the pawn with the move rook e5, and rook takes d5. And even though we're going to have equal number of pawns, white is going to have a slight edge because of control of the two major open files. But Boris Avruch actually found a much stronger idea instead of taking on d4 right away. And let me show you what it is. So if we go back to this position, and notice that the pawn on d4 is weak, but white doesn't have to take it right away, and he plays this very strong move, bishop to f3. Underline that I have still time to defend my pawn, whereas the pawn on d4 is really weak. And so black had nothing better to do than to sacrifice back the pawn and try to ruin white's very good pawn structure. But nevertheless, after queen takes, pawn takes, white has the upper hand. Much better bishop pair. Pawn on d3 is not a weakness at all. It can go to d4 later on, or even be supported by the bishop. But the key monsters are the bishops here. And the control of the c file should give white slight, but again, long-lasting edge. And it's a matter of technique. If your technique is not that great, you might get a draw. But if you're pressing with white and your opponent falters, it's very easy to get a point. So this is the c5 system, and the next we're going to look at the move knight to c6.